Policy interventions and financing mechanisms aimed at supporting economic growth, bridging the infrastructure financing gap, and enhancing climate resilience are important issues that generate significant interest. To talk about it, we receive Kevin URAMA, AfDB Chief Economist. Professor URAMA, welcome to Africa 24. Africa's economic growth is projected at 4% for 2024, yet global uncertainties continue to pose risk. What key policy interventions would you recommend to sustain this growth trajectory while addressing vulnerabilities?
Thank you very much. Like you've mentioned, Africa's economic growth in terms of GDP growth rates continues to be positive and encouraging, projected to be around 4% at the end of the year 2024. However, we have still several risks that continue to follow Africa, including the continued impacts of fiscal consolidation around the world, but also major continued dependence on raw materials and so on. So for Africa to be able to address these risks, we need to be able to focus on domestic revenue mobilization to address the debt challenges that continues to be a major challenge on this continent. But again, we need to refocus sharply on smart industrial policies that will help in pro-innovation within the industrial sector to add value to our natural resources. Because by creating value along natural resource value chains, we will be able to create jobs, we will be able to grow incomes and revenue for countries, and we're also going to be able to improve technology value added in our export commodities. So Africa continues to have that challenge because, of course, many people will say that there is no fiscal capacity for countries to do that. But that is why I would recommend three very well-known and tested policies. One is local content policies, and the other one is franchising policies. And finally, I would want to talk about preferred procurement policies. But again, there is no alternative to sound macroeconomic policy management, so we have to continue to refocus on fiscal discipline, on building capacity in public financial management to address corruption and reduce leakages in our public finance systems.
What can governments do to increase domestic revenue mobilization?
Most often when you talk about improving domestic revenue mobilization, people will think about increasing tax rates. That's not what I'm focusing on. We in African Development Bank, we focus more on improving tax efficiency in the administration of the tax system in countries so that everyone who is supposed to pay taxes, both citizens and multinational companies, are paying their taxes. That our customs and import-export duties are effectively collected, and that each individual who is supposed to pay tax does pay tax. So we need to improve the tax base instead of increasing the tax rate. So if we bring more people into the tax bracket, we'll be able to mobilize far much more revenue than we're doing now. And to put it in perspective, over about 83% of Africa's economies are still in the informal sector. So formalizing this formal sector and finding tax rates that is not going to be stopping growth in those areas will help governments to be able to mobilize much more revenue than trying to increase tax rate for in some countries have only 10% of people who are in the tax of the population in the tax bracket. But another place where we need to be able to mobilize revenue significantly is in the area of our corporate taxes. Like I've mentioned to you, we lose billions of dollars annually because of tax rebates that are given, and sometimes without very clear systems of monitoring the value added to the economies of these tax rebates we give to multinational companies that come to Africa. So companies that come to Africa to make money should be able to pay the requisite taxes that they would pay if they were doing the same business in their own countries. So that way, if we improve the tax efficiency through digitization and training of the tax agencies, we will be able to improve domestic revenue mobilization significantly. Currently, the tax to GDP ratio in Africa is just about 50.6%. And we could increase this to over 20%, like in other regions, and that will mobilize billions into the continent.
According to some economists, remittances are another way for Africa to finance its development. What is your take on this?
If you looked at financial flows into Africa in the year 2022, remittances was the only stable and slightly growing source of inflow into the continent, where we saw FDI, ODA, portfolio investments, all of them going down significantly, some by over 40-something%. Remittances continue to go up because these are assets of Africa that are out there and are remitting resources for consumption smoothing. So we need to find ways of securitizing these remittances so that it goes into productive investment that yields revenue not only for the country, for the citizens that people send this money for, but also for the remitter in the diaspora. Let's turn that into an investment class, and that will be very helpful for the continent.
The African Development Bank has emphasized the need to bridge the continent's annual infrastructure financing gap, estimated at $68 to $108 billion. How can innovative financing mechanisms and partnerships accelerate infrastructure development?
Okay, infrastructure development remains a critical sector for the continent, but I'll add productive infrastructure development. Productive infrastructure development in the sense, just like when I talked about debt, when debt is productive, it becomes a useful investment for growth. When infrastructure development becomes productive, it becomes a self-sustaining, a self-refinancing venture for countries. The challenge we have in many countries are sometimes politics defines infrastructure development. So we build roads that maybe doesn't have the highest impact with regards to revenue generation, job creation, and overall welfare improvements in the countries. So we need to first reprioritize our infrastructure development so that we're investing in corridors, for example, that helps to take our raw materials to market, in corridors that takes agricultural products to markets or brings inputs to agricultural products, so that the overall development additionality or development impact of those infrastructure investments is productive, and over time it's able to pay back for itself. So that's one thing that I would want to call for as far as infrastructure development is concerned. But in terms of sources of financing, the African Development Bank Group is established in 1964 with a core mandate on financing infrastructure on the continent. And we have invested and continue to invest billions of US dollars on infrastructure development across the continent. But again, countries must not rely on external financing alone. I've already talked about domestic revenue mobilization. So if we mobilize revenue domestically, we will be able to use that to build the necessary infrastructure that helps us to unlock value from our natural resources as well. Building roads where they matter, building train lines where they matter, identifying infrastructure value chains and resource corridors for which we have competitive and comparative advantages.
Let's talk about bankability of the infrastructure projects, which according to many reports and investors is still an issue. Why is it important and what is AfDB doing about it?
Because one of the major challenges of attracting financing for large infrastructure development is bankability of the projects. And that is why the African Development Bank established the Africa 50, and the Africa 50, now led by my brother Elena Bobise, is doing a lot of work helping African countries not only to identify but also prepare those projects and curate them for bankability. And one other initiative that the bank has put together is the Africa Investment Forum. That investment forum helps us to bring big projects together with project sponsors, governments, and all the agencies pertained to making those projects bankable and reaching financial closure. There's quite a lot that can be said about infrastructure development in Africa, but for want of time, I would just want to stop here.
Professor Kevin URAMA, thank you for answering our questions. Dear viewers, thank you for following us. Find the full program on MyAfrica24 and Africa24TV.com.